Hi guys, and welcome to my review of the debut album from horror punk band Creeper, known as Eternity in Your Arms. So for those who don't know, Creeper are a horror punk band from Southampton who, over the last couple of years, have received cult-like success. Ever since the success of their last EP, The Stranger, and also leading up to this album, people have just been going insane for this band. I personally first discovered them with their previous EP, The Stranger, and I was a big fan of it, especially with the tracks Black Mass and Astral Projection. I then went back and listened to all their previous stuff, and I just fell in love with the band and was super excited for this album. I followed all the promotional material and stuff for the album, which was surprisingly really interesting and definitely very different and something that I recommend checking out before listening to the album. I absolutely adored the 3 singles that came out of this album, so it was one of my most anticipated albums of the year, and I'm happy to say I was not disappointed. The band mixes elements of the band's Misfits, AFI, Alkaline Trio, My Chemical Romance with sort of the glam rock image of especially Ziggy Stardust era of David Bowie, and also kind of the theatrical style of people like Meatloaf. And I think all those elements are perfectly showed throughout this entire album. The album's actually a concept album inspired by the story of Peter Pan. It's basically about this paranormal investigator known as James Syfe who goes missing while investigating the characters from the previous EPs done by the band, especially The Callous Heart and The Stranger. And I think that was definitely a very smart thing to do, to link their previous 2 EPs with this album to make it kind of like this big trilogy, with this being the final huge concluding chapter. So to actually probably get into this album, I wanted to run through the track listing and talk about pretty much every single track on this album, because I think they really all have their own elements that need to be talked about. The album starts off with Black Rain, which is actually my personal and a lot of people's favourite Creeper song. You'd think it would be kind of a problem, the band putting their best song first on the album, kind of like they blow their load straight away, but surprisingly, its placement really works, and the rest of the album holds its own so well that I don't actually mind that their best song is the first song. The track starts off with a beautiful piano and choir, surprisingly. I mean, that's pretty strange for a punk band to have something like that, but it's actually something that the band utilised really well throughout the album, because they kind of have a very theatrical style to them, and piano and choir is very theatrical, so they use it perfectly in this album and it never feels out of place. There's a spoken word part which I think is fantastic, and it prepares you for the explosive sound of the rest of the track. The instrumentation all throughout this track is just fantastic, with this really solid guitar solo at the beginning, and it's actually kind of a shame because it's the only guitar solo on the album, and it's really good. It would have been nice to see more solos throughout the album, and I know that's kind of a thing that punk rarely does, but I think the solo in this track is so good and fits in so well that they could have done some fantastic things throughout the rest of the album with solos. There's a lot of palm muted guitars in this track, which is actually a staple for the band, and they do it in such a fast way. It's really impressive as a guitarist myself to hear people palm mute that fast, because it's really difficult. It's something that the band did a lot on their previous EPs, and it really sounds great throughout this track also. There's also a keyboard part which just expands the track, makes it sound huge and incredibly theatrical. Lead singer Will's vocals are just incredible in this track, and his melodies are incredibly catchy throughout the track also. Going back to what I said earlier about the choirs, they sound incredible in this track, and it makes it sound just gigantic and huge. The keyboardist in the band, Hannah, also has backing vocals on the track which are just great, and her screaming, "Darling, just you shut your pretty mouth," it just blows me away every single time I hear it. Speaking of blowing me away every time I hear it, that's something this track actually really does. I've listened to it dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of times now, and every time I listen to it, it gives me goosebumps. And that's a really impressive thing for a song to do after hearing it so many times. Usually the effect it has wears off after a couple times and it just starts to become boring, but surprisingly this song still holds its own and is still as incredibly exciting as it was the first time I heard it. The next track on the album is Poison Pens, which is actually one of the heaviest and most exciting tracks on the album. It shows the band's more hardcore punk influence, but it also has this softer bridge which just sounds beautiful, and then it explodes back into the huge distorted guitars and quiet parts. It sounds gigantic and it completely blows you away. Then we have the song Suzanne, which was actually the first single from the album, and it's one of the best on it in my opinion, one of the best the band's ever done. It definitely shows the band's knack for writing these incredibly catchy, pop-punk inspired songs. And it also reminds me a lot of the song Black Mass, which was on their Stranger EP. Throughout the track, Will shows off his incredibly operatic, like Meatloaf inspired style of singing, especially in the chorus, and it just sounds incredible. And all around, there's just fantastic performances from everyone on this track, with the thumping bass line, the explosive drum lines, in-your-face distorted guitars, and the atmospheric piano lines, which, although may not be super prominent in the mix, definitely help flesh it out and make the song sound so much bigger. And after this track, we have another highlight with me, which is actually the second single, Hiding with Boys. It's a romantic anthem about looking back at a past relationship. It's definitely, in my opinion, one of the catchiest tracks on the album, and it actually shows off Hannah's abilities of doing these fantastic backing vocals really well. And the bridge, especially with the "loving you is killing me" line, is just incredibly powerful, that line especially being one of the most relatable lyrics on the album. And if you own this album on vinyl, the last track of side A is the track Misery, which is actually the only track that follows over from the band's EPs. It's a beautiful and heartbreaking track which is played mostly on just a slightly distorted electric guitar, and there are these beautiful violin parts played by Hannah. Of course later on the track does explode and get really huge and epic, but it mostly for like the first couple minutes just has this really slow, tender sort of sound to it, which is just beautiful. Will's vocals are incredibly powerful on this track, and you can hear pain in every single line in the track, and it makes it so much more captivating. And I think unlike the other tracks on their previous EPs, this is the only one that actually I think makes sense to bring it over to the album. It's become a fan favourite, and I think compared to the other songs on their previous EPs, this is the only one that I think actually fits well into the style of the album. As much as I love their previous EPs, I definitely say they felt more of like sort of a collection of various songs, whereas this album actually kind of feels perfectly constructed. Like, the pace is fantastic and every single song just seems to fit there on the album. And the first track of side B is the track Down Below, almost new wave sounding track with this incredibly blondie sounding intro riff. They originally premiered this song on BBC Radio 1 like a week or two before the album came out, and I wasn't actually a big fan of it the first time I heard it, but when I got the vinyl and spun it for the first time and heard it again, it just blew me away and I fell in love with it. The chorus begs for people to scream it back in the band, with Will almost doing sort of like this call and response vocal line. And I think because of that, it easily has potential to become a live highlight for the band. And the bridge on this track, which seems to be something I keep complimenting on these tracks, is just incredible, especially where it just cuts out and it's just piano and vocals. It sounds beautiful. And as soon as this track ends, it explodes into the song Room 309, which is another one of the heaviest and most hardcore punk sounding tracks on the album. And again, it's one of my favourites. I love Will's vocals on this track, especially when he screams "Eternity in your arms," and then he lets out a little sigh before the second verse. I just love that bit, it sounds incredible. I haven't really talked about the drum work much on the album, but it sounds incredible in this track. Something he never really does is he doesn't have loads of complicated fills or anything, but he plays super fast and manages to keep the energy of the track going perfectly, something that's incredibly evident on this track especially. And the end of the track is just fucking beautiful when it just cuts out and goes to the acoustic guitars and Will and Hannah's vocal harmonies, which just complement each other perfectly. And speaking of acoustic guitars, we then have the track Crickets, which is the only acoustic track on the album, and also the only track where Hannah has lead vocal duties. And I have to say, she has an incredibly fantastic and powerful voice. She holds this track together incredibly. It's a beautiful track about a failed relationship, and a lot of people seem to be in love with this track and seem to be relating to it and everything, but I personally am not a big fan of it compared to everyone else. Like, it's not like I don't like it or anything, I really do like it, but I think compared to what everyone else seems to be saying about it, it's definitely not one of my favourites on the album. And speaking of which, we then have 2 tracks on the album which I think are definitely the weakest tracks. A big problem I have with these 2 tracks is they're kind of later on the album and it kind of seems to lose its quality a little bit as it goes on. I would have been a bit more fine with it if they were spread it out a bit, but these 2 tracks are like next to each other and it kind of ruins things for me. These are the tracks Darling and Winona Forever, which I'm not a big fan of at all. A lot of the tracks on the album do show off their influences really well, but these 2 tracks show them off so much that it kind of almost becomes derivative at times. I personally think that these 2 songs basically just sound like Creeper covering Alkaline Trio, and although I really like Alkaline Trio, I'm not sure these tracks really work that well. They're not terrible or anything, like, but I don't think I'd really go back and listen to them if I wasn't listening to the album again. And then we have the final track on the album, I Choose to Live, which is an obviously incredibly Jim Stein inspired piano ballad. It actually kind of reminds me of the slower tracks from the Rocky Horror Picture Show, especially the songs like Don't Dream It and I'm Going Home later on in the film. And I personally think this is the perfect way to end the album. Although it may be a little bit cheesy, that's honestly what gives the track charm for me. And later on, it does start to get louder and more theatrical, and I think it ends up becoming the most epic track on the album. It's personally one of my favourites. I know a lot of people aren't huge into it, but I love it. It just blows me away every time I hear it. And so, after hearing my thoughts on every single track, I think you can probably tell I'm really digging this album. I personally think it's the best and most theatrical punk opera since possibly The Black Parade. It's an album that's in your face and incredibly exciting, but also has these softer, quieter, more somber moments too. Lead singer Will Gold is kind of like a pastor for the Church of the Broken. He aims the tracks at people who don't fit in, who have dark and fucked up lives, in a way that I've actually never really seen done quite this well before. And I know that's something that's kind of like a cliche of pop punk, like writing songs for the young and the broken, or like the young and the hopeless, like the Good Charlotte album. But I honestly think that this album and the band in general do it better than anyone. And I really love the cult-like fan base of the band. The band have kind of been advertised as being like a huge cult that you're getting invited to. And I personally welcome that with open arms. I honestly think all the tracks on this album fit perfectly, even the ones I'm not big into. And I think each track also musically fits the visual aesthetic that the band were going for with all the artwork and the promotional material and everything. However, if there's a big problem I do have with it is that the concept does seem a little bit loose. I think that may have been intentional. I think it may have kind of been something that they were more aiming to show off in sort of like the promotional material, the music videos and everything like that. But I was like really captivated into the story of it, and I would have loved to have seen it developed in the songs a little bit more. But apart from that, I personally think this album is damn near perfect and easily one of my big contenders for Album of the Year already. So I give Eternity in Your Arms by Creeper a 9.5 out of 10. And also I should just say this is the signed purple vinyl. It's beautiful. It's one of my favourite records in my collection. So have you heard Eternity in Your Arms? If you have, let me know in the comment section below what you thought of it. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.